The rain had already begun to fall before dawn, slow and deliberate, tapping against the soot-streaked windows of Bellamy Ironworks. It slid down the glass like tears that no one had the courage to shed. Inside, the lamps burned low and yellow, their glow caught in the haze of coal dust that drifted through the air like a living thing. The hum of the city outside was distant now, replaced by the rhythmic panting of machines that seemed to breathe for the men who fed them. Pittsburgh, 1919, a city where the day never truly ended, where fire and smoke conspired to turn night into something else entirely. Upstairs, behind an office door fitted with frosted glass, a man sat alone, Arthur Bellamy. The name carried weight in the city. Like the toll of a church bell or the crack of a gavel, he was a man who measured worth in ledgers, who believed that numbers did not lie, even when men did. Before him a book lay open, its pages lined in neat rows of ink. The handwriting was sharp and cold, the figures exact. Each stroke of the pen was an act of faith, in profit, in progress, in power. And on the back of those numbers lay the backs of men. Below him, the factory floor roared with life. Sparks burst from the furnaces like dying stars, and the clang of iron was steady as a heartbeat. The air smelled of metal and oil and the faint, coppery tang of blood that no one mentioned. Among the figures that moved through the haze was a man named Elias Finch. He was quiet, the sort of man who carried his exhaustion like a second skin. To Arthur Bellamy, he was invisible, just another set of hands. But to those who worked beside him, Elias was the heart of the place. He tended the machines as though they were living creatures, whispering to them, listening when others cursed. Every morning, he arrived before the whistle. He would light the boiler fires and watch them bloom from black to orange. The warmth soothed him even as it stole his breath. His clothes bore the marks of years, burns, tears, the shine of grease that never quite washed away. There was something steady in him, something almost sacred, but sacred things do not last long in places like Bellamy Ironworks. The summer of 1919 was brutal, the air pressed down heavy, as if the sky itself were tired of smoke. Inside the foundry, temperatures climbed past reason. Men fainted and were dragged away by others who feared stopping more than death. Bellamy never came down from his office that season. He watched through his window, sipping black coffee, his collar spotless. To him, the suffering below was a sound, not a sight, a dull rhythm that meant work was being done. Elias Finch did not complain. He had a wife in the valley and a boy who liked to carve birds from scrap wood. Every hour he stayed meant another meal, another chance for the boy to have something better. But each day, the air grew thicker, the light dimmer, and each evening, when the whistle blew and the men stumbled into the streets, Elias stayed behind. He would clean the gears, wipe the oil from the machines, whisper to the furnace until its breath slowed. On the morning of August 12th, the sky outside was the color of ash. A storm was coming, though no one looked up long enough to notice. The clock above the floor struck 6, its chime swallowed by the roar of the machines. Elias's shift had already stretched through the night. His hands trembled. His chest ached. When he bent to lift another shovel of coal, his vision blurred. For a moment, he thought he saw something, his reflection in the furnace door, not his own, but older, colder, with eyes like Bellamy's. Then the world tilted. The men said it happened quietly. Elias fell forward, the shovel clanging once before sliding beneath the belt. He did not scream. He simply stopped moving. The foreman shouted. The machines slowed, then halted. The sound that followed was worse than noise. It was silence, a silence so deep it felt like guilt. They carried him out on a piece of tarp, his face pale beneath the soot. Someone crossed themselves. Someone else looked toward the office window, but the frosted glass revealed nothing. Upstairs, Arthur Bellamy paused his writing only long enough to listen. The absence of noise unsettled him. He frowned, dipped his pen again, and continued. Profit margins, labor losses, steam output, life converted to numbers. When the foreman came to report the death, Bellamy waved him off. Unfortunate, he said. Without looking up, hire another. The pen scratched on, indifferent. That night the storm broke. Rain hammered the rooftops, washing the streets clean of dust for the first time in months. Workers huddled in their rooms, listening to thunder roll across the river. In the factory, the machines stood still, slick with condensation, their metal cooling like a body left too long in the open. The watchman swore later that he heard the presses move on their own just once, a slow grind of steel against steel, and from the dark came a sound he could not explain, a whisper low and hoarse that spoke the name Bellamy. In his home on the hill, Arthur Bellamy could not sleep. The rain found its way through the cracks in his study window, leaving thin trails across the glass. He watched the drops gather, merge and fall, each one catching the light of his desk lamp before disappearing. The ledger still lay open. Ink pooled where the nib had stopped mid-word. He stared at it, tracing the faint reflection of his face in the sheen of the paper. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw another shape behind him, a man bent, shoulders heavy, soot on his brow, but when he turned, there was only the dim glow of the lamp and the empty chair. The next morning, the whistle blew as always, the furnaces lit again, and the rhythm resumed. A new man took Elias Finch's place by noon, but something had shifted. The machines began to misbehave in small, unsettling ways. Bolts loosened themselves, steam gauges faltered, belts slipped without cause. Bellamy blamed negligence, shouting orders, cutting pay. Yet every correction made things worse. The factory, once obedient, had developed a will of its own. One evening, after the others had gone, Bellamy stood on the factory floor for the first time in months. The smell of oil clung to him, foreign and sharp. He placed a hand on one of the great machines, feeling its cool surface beneath his palm. For a moment, he thought he heard it breathe. The memory of Elias's name flickered in his mind, unbidden and unwanted. He withdrew his hand, but the machine groaned softly, as if in protest. That sound followed him back up the stairs, echoing long after he closed the office door. He sat again at his desk, staring at the ledger. The rain had begun once more. Steady and thin, the ink on the last page was smeared, as though by a damp thumb. Bellamy reached for his pen but hesitated. The numbers blurred together. The smell of iron filled the room, not from below, but from the very air around him. He thought he heard footsteps in the corridor, slow and uneven. The drag of boots still caked in soot. The door creaked, though no wind touched it. When the night watchman made his rounds at midnight, he found the lamp still burning in Bellamy's office. The man was gone. Only the ledger remained open to the same page. The ink had run, forming a dark pool that bled through to the desk. Beneath, no one could read what had been written there last. Some said the heat from the lamp had warped the paper. Others swore the ink itself refused to hold his name. The next day, workers spoke in whispers. Some claimed to have seen a figure moving through the smoke near the furnaces, a man they did not recognize, his clothes stained with soot, his eyes fixed upward toward the office window. The machines, though, seemed calmer. For the first time in weeks, they ran smoothly. No slips, no breaks, no hissing valves. The factory worked as if it had finally exhaled. In the city ledgers, the death of Elias Finch was noted as workplace exhaustion. Arthur Bellamy's name remained untouched, his profits unchanged. But among the men on the floor, a different story spread. They said the machines had taken something from him that night. Not vengeance, not justice, just a balance, an accounting. And somewhere in the quiet hours before dawn, when the furnaces dimmed and the air was thick with cooling smoke, the factory itself seemed to breathe once more. Slow, steady, alive, waiting, because the ledger was still open. And history, like iron, remembers every mark left upon it. The smoke never really left Pittsburgh. It only changed color. In the weeks after Elias Finch's death, it drifted low over the valley like mourning cloth, curling through alleys and down chimneys until it felt as though the city itself were grieving. But grief, like soot, settles quietly and is soon swept away. By the time the funeral coal burned out, Bellamy Ironworks was already back to full production. The ledger lines grew again, steady and black. On paper, nothing had changed. Yet those who had known Elias whispered differently. They said the air inside the factory had turned heavier, that the furnaces hissed with a sound that wasn't quite mechanical. The foreman dismissed it as nerves, but rumors cling where truth is unwelcome. Some said Elias's heart had given out on its own. Others murmured he'd been driven past the limit, kept stoking until the veins in his arms pulsed like wires. all to meet a shipment bound for New York. The war had ended, but the greed that built it had not. Steel was no longer for battle. It was for empire. And Arthur Bellamy had no intention of slowing down. He attended dinners in marble parlors, where other men in waistcoats congratulated him for his efficiency, for making the machines obey. They drank imported whiskey, laughed about labor strikes, and called themselves the backbone of America. When someone mentioned Elias's death, Bellamy raised a hand as though brushing away a fly. "Unfortunate," he said again, the same word he'd used in his office that day. It was the word of a man who believed fate worked for him, not against him, but in the boarding houses along the Monongahela. Elias's widow washed her hands each night in cold water, scrubbing at the black that never quite left her skin. The sound of the river outside was a constant reminder. Water against stone, steady, indifferent. The women there spoke in low voices. They talked of wages cut, of shifts doubled, of men returning home coughing up smoke. And somewhere in every conversation, his name would surface like a ghost gasping for air. Elias Finch, the man who burned for someone else's fortune. Inside Bellamy Ironworks the work went on, but something had shifted. The belts that had once hummed in perfect rhythm now slipped when no one was near them. The pipes hissed even when the boilers cooled. One machine jammed so badly it crushed a beam like softened bone. The men grew nervous. They began to leave small offerings near the furnaces, a scrap of cloth, a folded prayer card, a coin blackened with age. When asked, they said it was for the one who watches. The foreman laughed, but he too began crossing himself before each shift. Arthur Bellamy didn't notice. Or rather, he refused to. To him, the talk of curses and spirits was the language of the idol. He believed in order, in precision, in the power of will. If the machines faltered, it was because men had grown careless. If the workers complained, it was because they had forgotten who fed them. And so he raised production again. More hours, fewer breaks. The whistle screamed longer now, its echo stretching down the streets like a cry that wouldn't end. Each morning, Bellamy walked the length of his office, watching the smoke rise from the stacks. He told himself it was progress, proof that his name would live beyond him. Yet sometimes, when the wind shifted, he thought he saw shapes in that smoke. Faces, perhaps. One in particular, blurred by distance but unmistakable in its stillness. It made him look away. At night, the factory loomed over the city like a cathedral. Its windows glowed orange, and from miles away it looked as though a second sun had fallen into the valley. The sound was constant. The hammering, the roar, the low breathing of machines that seemed too alive. The men inside worked as if bound to the rhythm of that sound, unable to stop even when their bodies begged them to. Bellamy's voice carried through it all, sharp and commanding, echoing down from the iron balcony above. To them he was less a man than a force, untouchable, inevitable. But the factory was beginning to remember. Metal holds memory. Heat and pressure shape it, but never erase it. Every rivet, every beam, every drop of oil carried the ghost of the hands that made it. The men on the floor could feel it when they worked, the tremor beneath their feet, the way the air seemed to listen. One night, as they repaired a jammed press, a young worker swore he heard a whisper through the hiss of steam. Not words exactly, but a voice, old, tired, and steady. He told no one at first. Then another heard it. Then another. They began to speak of Elias as though he had never left. They said he was watching the machines he once tended, that he was the reason the furnaces stayed calm despite the overwork. They didn't fear him. They pitied him. "He's still here," one man said. Finishing the shift they wouldn't let him end. The story spread until even the night guards refused to walk the floor alone. Bellamy heard the rumors and grew furious. "Superstition," he said, pacing his office. "That's what happens when men have too much time to think." But when the gears misaligned again, costing him a full day's output, his anger turned to something colder, not fear, but defiance. He ordered every machine inspected, every man questioned. He fired 2 workers for spreading hysteria. It didn't help. The very next morning, a boiler pipe burst without warning, scalding 3 men and flooding the room with steam. The walls echoed for minutes afterward, though the hissing had stopped. That night Bellamy dreamed of the furnace room. In the dream he was standing beside the great press, but everything was silent. No flame, no sound, only the faint drip of water. Then he saw a figure across the room, motionless, covered in soot. The eyes opened, and Bellamy woke to find his lamp still burning, the smell of iron thick in his study. He blamed the whiskey. Still, he poured the glass out before bed the next night. In the city, people began avoiding the factory after dark. The workers' families swore they could hear the whistles blow at hours when no shift ran, their sound carried by the wind. A widow passing by claimed she saw a man through the window, standing before the furnace with his hand on the control lever, though no one was supposed to be inside. The foreman laughed, but he stopped walking home that way. Through it all, the ledger continued to grow, its pages filled with numbers that no longer meant anything real. To Bellamy, they were proof of control. To everyone else, they were a measure of how much could still be taken. The war might have ended, but in his mind, victory was not peace, it was dominance. He believed the world rewarded men like him, men who demanded more, even from the dead. But something beneath that factory disagreed. One evening, a storm rolled through the valley, shaking the windows and filling the air with static. Inside Bellamy Ironworks, the lights flickered. The machines shuddered, gears slipping, belts snapping from their wheels. For a moment, the entire building seemed to inhale. The men froze. Then, from deep within the furnace, came a single heavy thud, and like the sound of a heart too big for its chest. The boilers went silent. When the power returned, every gauge read 0. No damage, no sign of fault, only silence. The men refused to start the fires again until morning. Bellamy called them cowards. But when he returned to his office that night, he found the door open. The wind had scattered his papers across the floor. The ledger lay in the center of the room, its pages fluttering as though caught in invisible breath. He bent to pick it up, and saw a dark smear across the margin. Not ink, something thicker. Grease, perhaps, or ash. He closed the book quickly, but the mark stayed in his mind. That night he dreamed again, of the furnace, of Elias's hand reaching out not in anger but in recognition, as though both men, master and servant, were trapped in the same endless motion. By morning, Bellamy had made his decision. He would raise production once more, push the machines harder, outwork the whisper of death itself. The ledgers would balance in his favor. They always had. He stood before his workers that day, his voice cutting through the clatter. "We serve progress," he said. "Not ghosts." But the men only looked at him, their faces pale in the half-light, the glow of the furnace reflected in their eyes. They didn't answer. The only sound came from the machines themselves, a low hum that seemed to pulse with memory. And for the first time Bellamy felt it too, the weight of the furnace pressing against his chest, heavy, human and alive. Some said the air that day was thicker than usual, that the light through the factory windows dimmed, though the sky outside was clear. Others said it was only the soot, rising again, drifting between worlds. Whatever it was, the work continued. The machines obeyed, but not him. Not anymore, because beneath the roar and the heat something else was breathing. And it was not finished. Snow came early that winter, soft at first, then heavy enough to mute the city and dull the clang of streetcars. The mills sighed behind a veil of white, their stacks pushing smoke into a sky the color of cold iron. Bellamy Ironworks stood like a dock, cathedral on the riverbank. The gates groaned when they opened. Lantern light trembled. Along the walls, the men said you could see your breath even near the furnace now. You could hear it too, that slow, patient sound of heat, like a beast asleep but listening. The inspector walked in with his collar turned up and a notebook in his coat, boots crunching cinders that felt like brittle bones. He had been called to check the lines after a string of strange failures, valves that would not seat, gauges that lied, a belt that tore under no load at all. He had a practiced way of looking without blinking. He had seen buildings that hid their hunger under fresh paint. He knew what greed did to timber and steel. He took off his gloves and held them in one hand, then asked for a lamp that did not flicker. The foreman gave him a face like stone and said he could look but not linger. The inspector nodded. Had heard this tone in other places where men had died. He stepped out of the office and into the engine room, and the wind at the door drew the smoke across the floor like a lace of grey, almost delicate until it touched your throat. The room was colder than it should have been. The furnace was banked, but the new bricks sweated black. He set the lamp on a beam and leaned his ear to the boiler. listening for a pulse, for the thin whistle that meant relief. All he heard was a small, steady drip on the far side. He followed it past the press, past the flywheels, past racks of tools whose handles shone with the touch of hands now gone. He saw a hairline crack on a pipe elbow and circled it in pencil. He wrote a note, he counted bolts, and saw two that did not match the set. He wrote another note, but it was the ash that called to him, not the big pile shoveled from the firebox, but the thin grey bed beneath the engine, too even to be random, too fresh to be old. Something had been scraped there, then covered like a grave. He knelt. The ash gave way under his fingers, soft, warm in one spot as if the room still kept a secret. He brushed until his knuckles hit metal, a panel, not a floor plate, a storage bin, but small and flush, and newly oiled around the edge so it would not squeal. He took a flat bar from the rack and worked it under the lip. The bin came up with a breath, and the smell hit him at once. Oil, damp paper, old sweat. He set the lamp closer. Inside lay a bundle tied with string and smeared with grease, the sort of string you cut with your teeth when both hands are busy. He slipped the knot. A letter fell open, torn across the middle as if someone had ripped it from a book. The top half was almost clean. The bottom had been burned at the corners and was pocked with soot. The handwriting was careful but tired. Letters leaned like men at daybreak. Mary, it began, and the name sat there like a prayer. If this finds you, it means I could not come home in time. The boiler shakes when it is hot. I told him, and he said the work will not end for a week yet. The seam sings. Mary, it sings in the dark. If I stop, I lose the job. If I stay, I think I lose the breath. The inspector read the lines again. Slower. He traced the black line that cut the page where the letter had been torn. On the lower piece, the writing turned more cramped. I will fix the crack if he brings the part. He says tomorrow and then says tomorrow. Again, the heat crawls into my bones. Tell our boy to keep the little birds he carves, keep them away from the fire. The last words were broken by a smear, as if a thumb had pressed hard and the ink had bled. The work will not end. Forgive me. There was no name at the bottom. There was no date. But he knew the voice. Everyone in that building knew it. Elias Finch, the man. The floor still said goodnight to when the whistle blew by. Mistake in the rain. The inspector stood and felt the room tilt for a breath, as if the building had exhaled. He folded the letter back into the bundle and slid it into his coat. He replaced the panel, wiped the edge with his sleeve so the oil would not shine. He marked 3 more faults while his hand still shook, and he made his way to the office. The foreman waited there with a ledger open and a face that said he would deny anything that was not a number. The inspector wrote out his report in slow lines. He listed the crack. He listed the false bolts. He wrote the word hazard in a way that took up the entire line. He kept the letter to himself. He had learned what bosses did to evidence written in a poor man's hand. When he finished, he signed his name and slid the paper across the desk. The foreman glanced at it and made a flat mark with his pencil beside 3 items, the kind of mark that meant, we'll see. He asked for the copy. The inspector kept the original and folded the copy into the foreman's ledger with a small, measured push. He put on his gloves. His breath made small clouds in the light from the window. He walked out with his collar still up. What happened next was the kind of thing that never appears in official books. The inspector took the bundle home and read the letter again at his table. Lamp turned low. His wife asleep in the room down the hall. He thought of his own boy and the time the boy had touched a kettle and learned too soon that things can look calm and still burn you to the hues. Bone. He slept little. In the morning he carried the letter to a man who printed news and had ink in his nails, a small paper that liked the truth better than the law. He kept his name from the story. He kept his job for now. The editor read the lines and did not speak for a long time. He traced one phrase with a finger, the part about the seam singing. Then he nodded and said he would print it tomorrow. He set the type himself. In the print room, the press clacked and breathed like a living thing. The metal letters rose and fell, caught ink, met paper, and left a mark no one could silence. By noon the next day, the words had moved from hands to hands. In the market, Women read them aloud and wiped their eyes with floury fingers. On the streetcar, men folded the sheet tight and passed it to the next calloused palm. In the boarding houses, a widow read the top half and whispered the bottom to herself, so it would sound like a voice. In offices across the bridge, owners snorted and said it was unproven. They said, as they always said, that weak men write strong stories. In a house on the hill, Arthur Bellamy set the paper aside with a slow smile that did not reach his eyes. He had seen storms pass before. He had friends, with rings on their fingers and seats on boards. He called a lawyer. He called two. He phoned a judge who liked the taste of his whiskey and the weight of his praise. By evening, the inspector's report had been stamped with a quiet word, pending. The second copy lay in the foreman's bottom drawer, under a blotter, under a key. The truth did not come to a full stop. It took a hard breath, but something had changed in the city. It was not rage, it was not even courage, it was attention. People walked past the iron gates and looked at them. They stared at the tall windows that glowed orange like stained glass. They counted the steps men took from door to floor and knew how far a body had to travel to bring bread home. And in the dark rooms near the river, old men who remembered other winters told stories of boilers that buckled and bosses who spoke of fate as if fate wore a watch and answered to payroll. The talk moved like a slow fire. Through dry grass, Arthur Bellamy could feel that heat even in his office. He felt it when he poured coffee and it smelled like scorched rope. He felt it when he ran a finger down a column of numbers and the ink smeared as if the paper did not want to carry the weight anymore. He told himself he would settle it the way he had settled everything, by proving he still ruled the flame. He told the foreman to prepare for a full run through the night. He would be there, he said, to watch the first pour. He would show the city the machines obeyed him. Not rumor, not grief, not a letter cut in two. He put on his heavy coat. He took the long stairs down, each step a dull note under his heel. It was the kind of night that makes breath look like speech. The yard lamps threw long bars of light across the snow. The great press loomed, and the furnace woke with a shudder that ran through the floor and into the bones. Men stood at their posts and avoided Bellamy's eyes. The foreman shouted the count, wheels turned, belts caught, the air filled with the bright dust of sparks. For a while, it worked. The rhythm returned, the one the city knew like a heartbeat. Metal moved, heat rose. The stack took in the cold and pushed out its smoke like a challenge to the moon. Then something began to sing. It was a thin, high sound, hardly music, hardly machine. The men looked at the gauges. They read perfect. The song grew anyway, and the note bent like light in heat. A gear stuttered, then caught again. A belt lifted and slapped back down like a hand. A bolt whispered loose without turning. The inspector, had he been there, would have heard it for what it was. The seam was telling its truth. The foreman called for a pause. Bellamy waved him on. The foreman called for a second pause, and Bellamy's voice cut the room like a blade. "Run it," he said, and the word carried the old power for one last time. Witnesses later said a hush fell inside the foundry. A hush so deep the men could hear the coal break in the furnace like glass. Even the whistles seemed to hold their breath. The press rose, the piston gleaming, the flywheel turning like a dark planet. For one long instant the whole room stood still, as if the night itself were looking down to see which way the story would go. Then came the crack. Not a snap, not a pop. A crack like thunder that starts under your feet and climbs you. Time softens even the sharpest noise. Decades after the press came down and the furnace sighed its last breath, Bellamy Ironworks stands quiet beneath the grey ribs of Pittsburgh's skyline. The smoke is gone now. The air almost clean, though the river below still carries a taste of iron when the wind shifts. The building that once roared with heat and men's shouts is now called a museum. They use words like heritage and progress on the brochures, printed in fine serif type that pretends not to tremble. To the school children who shuffle through on rainy days, the place feels heavy without knowing why. Its stillness too exact, its silence too measured, like a body that has learned to lie still only after a long struggle. The curator moves through each room with a flashlight instead of a lantern, but the light still bends against the same soot trapped in the grain of the brick. Each exhibit gleams under glass. Polished rivets, faded blueprints, tools lined like instruments in a case. Near the back, behind a rope that no one ever dares cross, stands the restored press. Its metal ribs glint faintly under the low lights, but no one can look at it for long. It towers there, neither asleep nor dead, a monument to what happens when a man believes steel can be tamed. On its base, a small brass plaque bears two words, Accident 1919. The letters are even and calm, the way truth never is. By day, the air smells of polish and floor wax. By dusk, it changes. When the last tour ends and the curator locks the front gate, the building exhales. The air thickens, sweet and metallic, like old oil stirred from the cracks. The pipes tick as they cool. Somewhere deep inside the wall, a faint dripping starts, steady, measured, almost like breath. The sound travels upward until it meets the clock above the entrance, the same clock that once ruled the lives of every man who labored there. Its hands are frozen now at 11:47, the moment someone long ago decided time should stop remembering. But if you stand close enough, you can still hear it tick. Faint, uneven, like a heart that refuses to stop long after its body is gone. Visitors never hear it. They see only the exhibits, the facts, the carefully printed captions. But the locals, the ones whose grandfathers carried ash in their lungs and sweat in their shirts, know what that ticking means. They speak of it quietly, on the bus home or in the bar after shift. They say it's Elias Finch keeping count, that he walks the floor after dark, his boots leaving no sound, his hand brushing the edge of the furnace like a man checking if the coals are ready. They say sometimes you can smell wet soot before the rain, even on the clearest day, and that's how you know he's near, some believe. Most just lower their voices when they pass the gate. In a glass case near the curator's office lies Arthur Bellamy's ledger. The ink has faded, but the handwriting remains. Sharp, clean, the kind that confuses neatness with virtue. The pages are turned to the last entry, a half-written line of numbers that trails off into nothing. Across the margin is a brown smear, thin as a fingerprint. Archivists call it rust. They've tried to clean it before with gentle brushes and fine cloth, but it always returns. Under bright light, the stain darkens like something remembering. The historians tell visitors it's a quirk of preservation, oxidation from the ink. But the families of the men who worked here, the ones who descend from Elias Finch, say otherwise. They call it justice. They say the paper holds the weight of a truth too long buried to wash clean. At night, when the street lamps flicker through the high windows, the factory floor comes alive in its own way. Shadows stretch long between the machines, folding and twisting like memories that never learned how to rest. The outlines of two figures sometimes appear when the light is right. One tall, one bent slightly at the waist, as if burdened by work. They stand near the press, frozen in the moment before something breaks. One might be teaching, the other might be begging. No one ever agrees on what they see, only that the shadows always end the same way. One dissolves into smoke, the other into darkness. The curator once stayed late to check the exhibits after a storm knocked out power. He carried a lantern, half a gesture to the past, half to the dark. He swore later that he heard the press shift, a low groan that trembled through the bolts. He saw the chain above it sway, though no wind touched it. When he stepped closer, he felt warmth against his face, heat without flame, breath without body. He told no one for a long time. When he did, he said it quietly over coffee, and finished with a sentence that sounded like a prayer. Some work never ends. The next morning, he found the ledger case fogged from the inside, as if someone had breathed against the glass. The stain on the page had deepened overnight. He left it that way. From then on, he stopped locking the back door until the clock's ticking faded, as though waiting for the factory itself to fall asleep before leaving. The museum board called him sentimental. The workers' descendants called him respectful. The truth sat between those two words, the way it always does. Outside, the world moved on. Steel was made elsewhere now, far from rivers and smoke. The city forgot the names that once filled the payroll books, the men who worked themselves into dust to keep the furnaces alive. Progress took their place, glass towers rising over the same soil where sweat once fell. The story of Bellamy Ironworks became a paragraph in textbooks, its cruelty polished into industry, its tragedy softened into folklore. But stories don't die. They rust, they wait. They cling to corners and crawl into the gaps of memory, patient as iron left in rain. Every few years a new curator arrives, young, earnest, untouched by the weight of it all. They try to brighten the museum, to make it modern. They add screens and digital plaques. paint over the darker corners. For a while the air feels lighter, but before long the same scent returns. Oil ash, a faint sweetness that no ventilation can chase. The lights flicker more often. The new curators last shorter each time. Some say they leave because of funding. Others whisper that it's the dreams. Dreams of a furnace glowing red in a world gone quiet, of footsteps on the metal stairs, of a hand reaching through smoke with the tenderness of forgiveness and the grip of guilt. If you visit on a winter evening, when the tours are done and the streets are slick with rain, you might see it yourself. Through the tall windows, a thin line of light burns along the floor, as if the machines have remembered the way to glow. You might hear a hum, soft and low, rising from the foundations, the old rhythm of labor. It doesn't frighten most people. It feels more like mourning than haunting. The city has changed, but memory has a longer reach than time. Sometimes school children on field trips ask about the stain on the ledger. Their teachers tell them it's rust. The guides nod politely and move them along. But every now and then one child lingers, staring at it. They tilt their head as if listening. And for a second, they look almost like they can hear the ticking too. They don't understand it yet. They just know that something happened here, something that refuses to be erased. And maybe that's enough. When the museum closes for the night, the city's hum fades. The wind moves down the river, brushing past the stacks, stirring the air like fingers through old hair. Inside, the press stands in shadow. The plaque gleams faintly. Accident 1919, 2 words that hide an entire lifetime. The clock above it ticks once, faint but certain. Then silence again, thick, absolute, alive. Somewhere in that silence the story keeps breathing. The servant and the master. The machine and the man. The weight of what one built and what the other bore. The press, the ledger, the stain. All of it folded into the same quiet truth. No man who builds his power on another's suffering escapes the sound of what he's made. The echo lives on, steady as steel, cooling in the dark, whispering through the dust for anyone who still dares to listen. Some names only find peace when the truth is told.